Again, welcome to everybody in the general program Practical Ethics for Bachelor students of all study programs at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. Here comes the lesson 2. The menu shows where we stand. We turn to shareholder versus stakeholders, and we also will discuss a few cases described in detail. And there's a few arguments from philosophy which may be somewhat interesting. For the sake of specificity, let's start with a concrete problem. Assume you are a manager of a firm that is owned by an entrepreneur who owns the whole firm. You are a manager who has entered a contract with the entrepreneur. From this follows a moral obligation to do what the entrepreneur wants you to do. You have to pursue the aims, ends, or values since you have promised to do so, and the entrepreneur, let's assume this, is operating within the limits of property and legitimate law. So you are bound by your promise to follow what he wants you to do. If the principal's aim is environmental protection, well, that's what you have to do. If it is protecting jobs, that's what you have to do. And if it's profit maximization, well, then that's what you have to do. Why? Well, nobody is forced to enter an employment contract. You have entered it freely and therefore within the bounds of legitimate law and the bounds of legitimate promise giving, you are basically obliged to do. Now assume you are the manager of a large company. You are an agent of that company which has a wide circulation of shares. Again, as a manager, you have a contract with the company. From this follows a moral obligation to pursue the aims, ends, or values of the principals within the limits of legitimate law. Seems to be completely analogous to the case of the single entrepreneur. However, the principals will pursue a plurality of values. Where before there was an entrepreneur who was pursuing his aims, ends, or values, you now have several aims, ends, or values of several people. In this situation, only increasing shareholder value can express the moral respect for the plurality of the values of the shareholders, of your principals. That seems to be rather clear. 4. The higher the value, the better your principals can pursue their own ends, aims, or values after selling the shares. It is very clear that also their act of staying on board, their act of not taking the exit option, is signaling more of an assent when the external price of the share is higher. So the best thing you can do as a compromise between the many aims, ends, or values of your several principals is to increase the value of the shares. After all, there is not one conception of moral value, but always a plurality. Those people who want to secure jobs can seek a company with that primary aim. Those who want to secure the environment can go to a company that does this, and so on. So, the strong argument in favor of shareholder value is one of a moral kind, not, as you sometimes may hear, that profit maximization is the only natural thing in capitalism or something like this. This is all crap. That is not a convincing moral argument, and it's not even a very good and sound economic argument. The real argument, I believe, is an argument of a more or less Kantian respect for the plurality of values, and interpersonal respect is driving the whole thing. And clearly, with Milton Friedman, who was an arch-liberal in these things, the basic normative proposition is of the kind I described. Nowadays, most people reject the view that shareholder value has to be center stage. They typically don't understand it as a moral position as developed before. They rather think that this is the support of a simple economic logic. But there is no such simple economic logic. That has to be acknowledged. There is a complicated or somewhat complicated argument for moral pluralism. Another moral argument offered against and in competition to the Friedman argument comes from Edward Freeman. He thinks that the view that a company has to be run according to the interests of the shareholders is mistaken in any event. It is just not good management. He argues that shareholders are not the only stakeholders whose interests matter, and therefore we should not go for shareholder value. As I said, this is not only a normative view, it is also a factual conception of how a good company, a good run company works. The reason is that stakeholders must not be treated as means to shareholders' ends. This is, as I said, not a good management principle because stakeholders who are treated as means to ends will not contribute as much as is desirable to the success of the company. Therefore, we have a good reason to treat stakeholders as individuals with equal respect as we do treat shareholders. A company that would treat employees as mere means to ends will not make much profit over the long haul. However, with Freeman, this is also a more Kantian claim of fundamental respect rather than simply a means to an end. He also denies the privilege of ownership in a moral setting, and this is certainly the more doubtful starting point, and it seems that Freeman himself became a bit more reluctant in later years about this. So to sum up a very long story in a nutshell, we can say that most concerns of a Freeman position, according to which it is bad for the company if we pursue shareholder value in a very narrow-minded, direct way, can be supported within a means-ends framework. We can say that it is better to pursue stakeholder interests in the interests of the shareholders than to do the opposite. There is a good reason to assume that most of the time doing well by doing good is the right strategy. It is psychologically quite understandable that during the banking crisis, the public sensibilities concerning behavior of banks were really increasing. This was also something that triggered the criticism on shareholder value maximization. It was argued, at least by the more sophisticated people, that the bonus systems of banks were implemented in view of increasing shareholder value. And then it was argued in the next step that practically all the banking scandals, which were real scandals, could be blamed on the bonus system and therefore indirectly on the weird and bad motives of profit maximization, shareholder value maximization, and so on. The moral status of the reasonings for shareholder value was not really seen at all. So let us look at one typical scandal, and this is a scandal that is largely independent of the LIBOR scandal. Interestingly enough, this scandal has an upside, and this is what is described in the next pages or slides. It shows that you have to look at cases in a complex way, because they are typically complex. The LIBOR, the London Interbank Offer Rate, is a reference rate that is most important for fixing many transactions and the rates that have to be paid there. The revelation that Barclays and other big banks schemed to rig LIBOR, a critical global interest rate, sent shock waves across the world of finance. Top bank executives resigned, central bankers launched probes into how rates are set in Britain, Sweden, Japan and elsewhere. Some commentators call the scandal one of the worst in history. But is it possible that the manipulation actually had an upside? That means, as we may add here as a comment, is there something or has there something been going on that was in the public interest? As analysts assess the fallout, there has been a lot of fog and little clarity about the precise impact on the global economy, markets, investors and average consumers. While many lost because of the rigging, many others, aside from the banks, may have benefited. Sorting out the winners and losers in terms of following the money and how it nets out is going to be tremendously complicated, said Stephen Bainbridge, a professor of business law at the University of California at Los Angeles. Fine, we may add here. But even if the LIBOR has an upside, deceiving others is such a bad thing that it can't be made good by having good consequences along some or many dimensions. Still, let's go on with the text from the Washington Post. Barclays was found to have reported sometimes officially low rates. So consumers whose mortgages, auto loans or student loans were linked to LIBOR may have paid less. On the other hand, investors who were paid interest based on the benchmark rate, which included investment funds and municipalities, would have lost out. Perhaps the most difficult question about the scandal is whether violating the public interest or trust, especially when much of the illegal activity occurred in the credit crisis of 2008, helped prop up the financial system overall. In part because it was often reporting lower borrowing costs, Barclays was treated in the crisis as one of the world's strongest bank or strong banks. In fact, officials at the Federal Reserve and elsewhere tried to get Barclays to buy Lehman Brothers as it was collapsing. Before going on, let us be clear on the fact that, again, This does not in any way justify what happens in the scandal, and it is not an effort to blame part of the guilt on the general public. It is really an effort to find out the facts of a case and to see the multifaceted nature of most moral problems in business. So let's go on reading. Some analysts speculate that for this reason the Fed may not have pushed aggressively to stop the rigging of LIBOR, even though it had evidence in 2007 that the rate was aberrant. There is a tension, and they opted for the path of least resistance, which is to acquiesce in the rigging of the LIBOR rate. Said Cornelius Hurley, a law professor at Boston University and former Fed lawyer. And comes the next citation. That just happened to coincide with what they were trying to do, which is free up the credit crisis. On multiple occasions during the financial crisis, federal regulators, including the Fed, weighed whether to overlook the enforcement of regulations in order to protect financial stability. A comment on this is, well, they had also to make difficult decisions with conflicting interests. And there was nothing very clear-cut. There was only a somewhat clumsy and, well, quick and dirty solution of many problems. In some cases, they sidestepped rules. The Fed was faced or has faced congressional allegations of doing so, but no definitive proof has emerged. With LIBOR, officials say they responded promptly to what they learned, alerting the appropriate authorities in the United States and Britain. The United States, to its credit, set in motion at that stage a very, very powerful enforcement response, the first of which you have now seen. Treasury Secretary Timothy F. Geithner, head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York at the time, LIBOR was being rigged, said this week, central bankers who have been under fire are planning to meet to discuss alternatives to LIBOR. Geithner will face sharp questions on LIBOR in Congress next week. Since 27th of June, when Barclays settled its LIBOR case by paying a $450 million regulatory fine, many have said the bank's actions accounted to an egregious breach of public faith that will damp confidence in financial markets. The bank also acknowledged that several traders rigged the rate for personal profit, sometimes increasing the rate. Prices are fundamental mechanisms for savings and investment decisions. Even the decision to eat today versus to save for tomorrow depends on good, accurate prices, said Andrew Ng, a Columbia Business School professor. We all lose by having bad prices. It undermines free markets, although the scandal adds to concerns that Wall Street lacks respect for the rules. The markets overall seem unperturbed. They seem unperturbed. Is this right or wrong? The US stock market is up 4% since the scandal was unveiled. And bank stocks have also done well except for Barclays. LIBOR rates have barely moved. LIBOR, which stands for London Interbank Offered Rate, plays multiple roles in the world economy. It's the benchmark for trillions of dollars of private student loans, credit cards, auto loans and mortgage. Set in London after large banks from the United States, Europe and Japan submit their borrowing costs to a tabulator, it's also used in hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of financial contracts known as derivatives. And we should add here the guys in London, in the United States, in Europe and in Japan all have an incentive to manipulate once in a while since their bonuses depend on it. Nevertheless, it's unclear in which direction the effects go, whether they are good or bad for other people, and normally they will be good for some and bad for others. Barclays has indicated in testimony and in emails, now public, that it wasn't the only one trying to rig the rate. LIBOR is so pervasive in the financial system that it's difficult to follow the complex chain of events stemming from any single action. It's a zero-sum activity, said Conan Snyder, an economics professor at UCLA, who wrote a paper in 2010 raising questions about how a LIBOR is calculated. If you know the banks are enriching themselves by doing this, then it sort of has to be at the expense of someone else, even if it's difficult to figure out who is on the losing end. A borrower, for instance, could have paid less than they would have otherwise for a loan because the interest rate was rigged to be lower. But that would mean the bank is making less money off the loan. The community bank and trust of Sheboygan, located outside Milwaukee, has filed a lawsuit against the major banks saying that this very thing happened to smaller community banks. Cities such as Baltimore are also filing suit. There are two sides of every LIBOR-based transaction, said David Kotok, Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of Cumberland Advisors. Somebody had to lose for somebody else to have had a windfall. If you overpaid, then somebody under-received and vice versa. Well, there's a lot to think about here. And there are other papers as indicated at the bottom on the topic. Nevertheless, you can make up your mind, you can discuss the pros and the cons of the case, and you can think about what the crucial facts are. Then you should think about general principles to deal with these facts in a normative way. Truth-telling, honesty, public interest, and so on. And these general principles do not necessarily lead to clear-cut answers. There is the issue of how to regulate the field, and there is the issue of how to deal with other aspects if you are a player in the game. You face then the regulations that are made by politics in typical arrangements and compromises. You have to cope with the regulation and you have to be acting as a law-abiding company or citizen. While you do that, you face conflicts of interest and some moral conflicts. You have an obligation, say, to act on behalf of your shareholders. So you have to play the game as a participant that is not neglecting monetary income. On the other hand, there are other stakeholders, and this actually in a way represents the general or common interest in bits and pieces of particular interests, and you again have to cope with it. Think about what is going on here. What are the general lessons, moral or other, to be learned, if any? So the question is really, is there anything to be learned? And if so, what exactly? Many people, after the crisis hit, came to the conclusion that the whole system is morally doubtful, that it is a questionable system in which too much is made subject to market transactions. This view has been articulated very powerfully by Michael Sandel in his book What Money Can't Buy. The era of market triumphalism has come to an end. The financial crisis did more than cast doubt on the ability of markets to allocate risk efficiently. It also prompted a widespread sense that markets have become detached from morals and that we need somehow to reconnect them. But it's not obvious what this would mean or how we should go about it, says Michael Sandel. He also says, we need a public debate about what it means to keep markets in their place. To have this debate, we need to think through the moral limits of markets. We need to ask whether there are some things money should not buy. And it's significant that we have the term should here. When Michael Sandel says money can't buy something, he normally means that things should not be bought. It's a normative statement rather than a descriptive one, because he is actually complaining that money can buy these or other things. The reach of markets, he goes on, and market-oriented thinking into aspects of life traditionally governed by non-market norms is one of the most significant developments of our time. End quote. Why worry that we are moving towards a society in which everything is up for sale? He asks. He asked actually the right questions, and he gives two reasons. One is we should be worried about the inequality that is involved here. People have different amounts of wealth, and therefore if more becomes subject to market transaction, wealth invades all these realms in which market transactions are made, thinks Sandel. So when there were certain realms of human interaction that were independent of differences in wealth because they were independent of wealth on the whole, then by making them subject to market contracting, these realms become wealth dependent and thereby inequality plays a greater and greater role. This is presumably basically right. However, two remarks should be made. First, wealth will play a role even if markets do not. If it comes, say, to the selection of sexual partners, people seek to find a wealthy one and prefer a wealthy to a less wealthy one for marriage. They might not do so consciously, but as a matter of fact, this is what happens. Secondly, you can choose the right pont, so to say. That means you go along with people of your own wealth and you segregate partly from the society at large. In that case, the effects are dampened, even if your group as a whole may be subject to market transactions. Nevertheless, the argument about inequality in wealth affecting more and more interpersonal relationships has to be taken seriously, and the market transactions are really expressive of the whole thing. The other complaint is about corruption. And Sandel is conspicuously silent about the way things are corrupted in detail. He argues that money is corrupting higher values and that there is a corrosive tendency of markets because they place a monetary value on absolutely everything. Now, why is money a lower value? What is the argument? You may think about that. Sandel certainly didn't think about it sufficiently. He just relies on a higher value is replaced by a lower one. So if it is, say, organ donation in the family, that's something that happens to higher values. If the organ is sold, then it's obviously transactions done with lower values. Now, a sober-minded person will say that within a family, not all the values expressed are higher values. There may be social pressure actually on the donor in the family to donate for another family member. There may be all things going on. So it's worth thinking about these things. Here is what Sandel says himself. Here comes what Sandel has to say himself. But as money comes to buy more and more political influence, good medical care, a home in a safe neighborhood rather than a crime-ridden one, access to elite schools rather than failing ones, the distribution of income and wealth looms larger and larger. Where all good things are bought and sold, having money makes all the difference. And then he goes on to support his view that money corrupts and markets corrupt. It is not about inequality and fairness, but about the corrosive tendency of markets. Putting a price on the good things in life can corrupt them. That's because markets don't only allocate goods. They also express and promote certain attitudes toward the goods being exchanged. Paying kids to read books might get them to read more, but also teach them to regard reading as a chore rather than a source of intrinsic satisfaction. Auctioning seats in the freshman class to the highest bidders might raise revenue but also erode the integrity of the college and value of its diploma. Certainly, Sandel articulates many concerns of our times. We became very skeptical about the operations of large financial markets, at least many of us. We should, however, be aware that the skepticism about money and monetary relationships is a very old one. Human beings don't feel at home in the so-called great society in which everything is subject to mutual agreement and contract and monetary payments going along with it. This, as I said, is articulated well by Michael Sandel, and so everybody with a critical approach towards market transactions should discuss Sandel. But there are many queries that may be raised in view of Sandel. For instance, first, is it corruption if two people mutually agree on something that we do not like or morally resent? For the real issue is not money. The real issue is whether we should let people do what they agree to do in mutual assent. The phrase consenting adult that was used to tell society and the state at large to keep out of personal relationships is something that could be used for any contract, for any transaction between two mutually agreeing people. And then it becomes clear that it is not the money, but the liberty that is really at stake. The liberty to agree on contracts. Now that liberty is something that we may want to restrain or restrict sometimes. Constraints may be imposed, but it is very clear that most of us regard it as one of the essential good things in life that they may reach consent with other people on certain transactions, that they are free to do so. And then clearly money is part of the story most of the time. This, however, means that Michael Sandel's arguments must be taken with not only one but many grains of salt. Secondly, if we observe people to agree on things we do not agree with ourselves, should we go for discussion and debate then only? Well, that's what Michael Sandel says, and I believe that is a legitimate thing. But it's rather natural in the public mind to think that then it's the state's responsibility to go into details. That is, regulation is around the corner, not only making up our critical minds, discussion and morals. And again, we have a risk that institutional and legal changes that are restricting our liberties are imposed. Again, it is very obvious that some restrictions, some regulations on top of the regulations that we have should be imposed. This is what political and ethical debate is all about. Well, it's a lengthy debate. And your attention span may be reduced like that of the chaps on the picture.